Yeah, buddy, you've downloaded Tropical Talk Radio, where we talk about all things entrepreneurship, travel, and lifestyle. If you're interested in more about this program, check out TropicalMBA.com. And if you sign up for our mailing list, I will personally send you 50 free podcast episodes that take you along on our journey and expose the insider story on how we started $1 million honest-to-goodness product business while we traveled the globe.
Hey everybody, happy Friday. I couldn't be happier that you decided to join us here today. I gotta assume that you're looking for a weekend full of fulfilling work. I gotta assume that you've made a conscious choice in your life to build things that are of true value to others, to live a better life through that work. And I was thinking about some of this stuff, on Thursday's Lifestyle Business Podcast, we talked about the attention economy. And I've really been thinking about, what that means and how important not only it is for us earning the attention of others, and that's why I'm so thankful you're here, but the importance of deciding how we spend our attention. And I thought a lot about that today, and it reminded me of an audio that DCer Dylan Hassinger sent me a while back. And I always wanted to play it on the podcast, and I never did because I don't know, I just never got around to it, and it's just sort of weird sort of handing off the podcast to a guy who's now passed away for a long period of time. But I just can't talk about attention and consciousness better than Mr. David Foster Wallace. And this is a speech called "This is Water," and it was given as a commencement speech at Kenyon College. And, it's sort of fitting with what we're doing here. We've got the college education motif. It is the end of the week. It's sort of a reflective time, thinking about what we got accomplished this week and what we're going to do this weekend to make our lives better. And, also, to be honest, I'm on a tight book deadline this weekend. And instead of waffling on to you guys, I wanted to play for you these thoughts by Mr. Wallace, and they're incredibly well formulated, incredibly well written, and I found them to be really thought inspiring. And so I hope that you find the same thing. And so we're going to call this, if you cannot exercise this kind of control in your adult life, you'll be totally hosed. And this applies in particular for people trying to do great work like entrepreneurs. I hope you enjoy this audio, and I will see you next Friday afternoon. Anybody
parents and older folks here will know all too well what I'm talking about. Which means yet another grand cliche turns out to be true. Your education really is the job of a lifetime, and it commences now. I wish you way more than luck.
Hey everybody, thanks for listening. Don't be shy. We've got a mailing list. Check it out at tropicalmba.com. Get yourself signed up, and we'll keep you up to date on everything we do, plus give you those 50 free podcast episodes. If you want to say, hey, check me out on Twitter at Tropical MBA. We'll see you soon.